So welcome everybody. There's some familiar faces, but also some new faces here. So first, I want to say that my name is Saul Cunningham. I'm the director of the Fenner School of Environment and Society, and we're hosting today's event. And we have done for I'm told Albert reminded me, it's 9 years now we've been doing this. So this is the production of Australia's Environment Report has some really significant history, and I think it's had growing impact over that time. It's a great opportunity to learn about environmental trends, but also I think it's really interesting to look at the improvement in the science and how we monitor and report the nature of Australia's environment. And it's a really, data-rich and very usable product that I strongly encourage you, as I'm sure all the speakers will, go and look at this on the web, because what we hear today is going to be exciting, but what you can do with it sort of on your own computer is fantastic. It's a very usable and useful product. I want to acknowledge that we're meeting on the unceded lands of Ngunnawal and Ngambri people today, and their knowledge is based on many millennia of living in this land, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So at that point, actually, I'm going to pass to Beryl Morris, who can then introduce who today's speakers are. But welcome, everybody. Thanks, Beryl.
Thanks, Saul. Can you hear me? At the back? Yep. Okay. Great to be here and to see some lovely familiar faces. This is something that has been going for quite a while, so I think we have developed quite a loyal following. I'm not going to talk very much because we've got some fantastic speakers. We have Albert van Dijk, who's been in charge of this since the beginning and is the chief author, and I'm really happy to be able to introduce Taylor Laurie from TERN. And I forgot to say, for those that don't know you, I'm Beryl Morris, the director of TERN, which is the Australian government-funded National Observatory of Ecosystem Change, which is why we love Australia's Environment Report, because it's tangible evidence of some of the changes in more recent times. So, Albert, if you would like to come up and take us through some things. And by the way, audience, we need some questions from you at the end, so please start making note of the things that you want to ask. I'll be back for those.
Thank you, Beryl. And thank you all for coming here today. As Beryl said, it's the 9th year we're doing this. We haven't always been doing the briefings, of course, with a bit of interruption with COVID. We're doing it reasonably briefly this morning because the value of a meeting like this is that we can have an interaction. We can discuss, we can ask, you can ask questions, and so the actual presentation will be a bit brief, and then have a lot of time for questions and discussion, and after that, I believe there's also some catering outside. If you have time to hang around, then please join us and let's talk some more. But launching into it, I want to acknowledge Shoshana Rapley, who unfortunately for us can't be here. Fortunately for her, she is doing something even more exciting in Europe at the moment. Very briefly, so what we do in this report is basically try and trawl through the mountains of information that we have on our environment, both on the drivers of environmental change and on the impacts on our environment. And so we go through government data, we go through satellite data, through measurement station data, survey data, on a whole range of indicators. And what we're trying to do is summarize that in a way that's accessible. But of course, as you do that, as you summarize anything, you start to lose detail. And so that's an important caveat. We try and provide information at different levels, but of course at the highest level is a single score, which hides a lot of variation. And that was especially true last year. Of course, we do try to be transparent, and you can find all the underlying data in our Data Explorer, which is accessible via the Australia's Environment website. That you'll see the link of later, but is also in your report if you picked up a report, which I hope you did. Yep, the first report was in 2015. And the themes that we report on global change: oceans, weather, fire, water, people, soils, vegetation, biodiversity. And when I say those things, that, as I said, there's some drivers, there's some impacts there. When I say people, I'm recognizing that people have many different impacts on the environment, through our emissions, through our land use, through pollution and so forth. We try to find indicators that tell us something about those drivers as well as on the impact. So we do focus on nationally available data because we try to provide a national picture, which means leaving out some data that might be available for different states or even more local areas. That's inevitable, of course. That's what you have to do if you create a national picture. And we only use data that is frequently updated because we want to provide a current picture. Of course, every 5 years, the Australian government produces a State of the Environment report where they kind of try to get everything above the table that is available. What we do is only things that we can try and say something about from year to year, just to create a bit of consistency and a bit of an opportunity to track what's going on in those intervening years. So launching into it then, the summary of it, I suppose, is look at the bars. This is the total environmental score, environmental condition score, I should say. And I should also say this is a score that, we're not marking people that manage the environment or affect the environment. We're basically trying to score the favorability of the environmental conditions for the environment to function, recover, grow, be resilient, and so forth. So we're looking at a combination of information on climate, on water availability and distribution, on vegetation growth and soil protection, and tree cover, and on hot days, as we recognize that heat waves have quite a considerable effect, not only on people, but also on our fauna and flora, and crops, of course. So the summary is that last year was a very reasonable year on the scale of things. It reached 7.5 out of 10 if we score it in that way. That's coming off the back of a very high score the year before, which basically was the result of 3 La Nina years and water building up in the environment, if you like. What we did see last year is that if you start digging a bit deeper below that 7.5, it was a very up and down year. It was a pretty wild ride. We started off very wet. We then had very dry and unseasonably warm months from May to October. And then it got wet again, just in time to prevent another catastrophic fire summer, fortunately. So while that 7.5 is a good score, and it's a national score, of course, there were also geographic differences. WA didn't have quite as good a year. Parts of New South Wales didn't have quite as good a year. But some other parts of the country, especially Northern Territory, had a very good year. So there's a lot of variation once you start digging, but on average, it was a reasonable year in terms of environmental conditions. And that's what you see here. As I said, there's some differences in scores there. The Northern Territory, 8.8. Western Australia, 5.5. So I've mentioned the highest and the lowest there. But all of them above average, all of them above 5 if you like, and generally conditions were reasonable. The ACT, if you're interested especially, had a 6.9. Now if you grab the scorecard, you see a different number on there, which is a consequence of the fact that that scorecard is for the electorate, the federal electorate of Canberra, which is only a small part of the ACT, and especially vegetation and wetland indicators were quite different for that smaller part of the ACT than for the ACT as a whole, where of course we're still seeing their slow recovery from the bushfires, for instance. So if you were wondering about that, then there's your explanation. You can find all the scorecards online for any federal or state electorate, for natural resources management regions, for states and territories, for local councils, and so forth, catchments, bioregions, go on. So I'm not going to talk through all of this. There's, if you like, a few headline indicators that we provide as well that give you a bit of an idea of how last year was in comparison to the 23 years before that, and that's what you see here. So orange is, it was less favorable, if you like. And for instance, the ozone hole was a bit bigger than on average in the previous 23 years, but many of the water and climate and vegetation indicators were higher, were better than average. We see temperatures, of course, are still higher than average, although last year was not the hottest year on record, unlike most of the world. Most of the planet had the hottest year on record. Australia did not, mainly because it rained at opportune times, if you like, keeping temperatures down a bit. But it was still the 8th equal hottest year, and all the hottest years, all those years occurred after 2005. So we're clearly seeing a trend, increasing temperatures, but that trend was a bit subdued last year. I won't talk about the abundance of threatened species because Taylor's going to talk about that, but you can find that in the report as well. As I said, global change is there. We're experiencing it. Unfortunately, globally, the rate of greenhouse gas concentrations change increased again, which is completely the wrong direction, as you'll appreciate. It was the hottest year on record. Sea ice was the least ever observed. So, indicators globally were quite, even surprised many climate scientists, this is not going the right way. And it's easy to forget about that living in Australia, but, not so easy to forget if you lived in one of the many countries affected by record temperatures last year. Global sea level rise also accelerated last year. Sea surface temperatures also broke new records. Ocean temperatures around Australia were not quite as high as the year before, but we're now starting to see changes in that. The eastern seas, the ocean east of Australia is very warm at the moment, and lo and behold, there's another mass bleaching event going on at the moment in the Great Barrier Reef. That didn't happen in 2023, but it is happening again now. So once again, we're seeing the heavy footprint of global warming there. People then. Australia's population grew very rapidly in the last year. You probably read that on elsewhere already. But when you start to think about it, we now have 27 million people. And around about the time that I came to Australia, in 2000, we had 19 million people. That's 41% more. You're forced to think about it. 41%. You only see that in some developing countries beyond Australia. No other industrialized country has got a population growing that fast. And I make that difference because, of course, per person, per capita, we've got a huge emission footprint, unlike many developing countries. So our emissions are also rocketing up, relatively speaking. Actually, that's not quite the case. They're more or less stable. They did go up last year, but I guess we're trying to. We've got to balance the emissions per person are going down little by little, but our population is going up, and that more or less balances out. As you can see in this graph, our emissions are more or less stable over the last years. And if you compare this with almost every other developed country, industrialized country, you see that curves are bending down quite steeply. Ours is just staying up there. We're not managing to get it down. I think I mentioned emissions were up mostly because of domestic air travel increasing again after COVID. I already said a little bit before, rainfall on the whole was almost exactly average across the year, but it was very unevenly distributed. A wet start of the year, very dry middle, and a wet end of the year again. In terms of national distribution, it was actually a bit more evenly distributed, but we did have some regions, especially WA, as I said, that are starting to see the first signs of drought potentially. And that gets translated into river flows. They were above average for part of Australia, especially northern Australia, which had a very good monsoon, but they were well below average, especially for those winter rainfall dominated areas in south of WA and also in Victoria, for instance, where most of the rain normally falls in winter and generates most of the river flows in winter. We saw much lower river flows. And indeed, in some cases, the lowest for the period since 2000. The flood and wetland extent decreased somewhat in some catchments, but generally remained more or less stable. You can only expect it to decrease after a very wet year before that, so that in itself is not surprising. But generally a reasonable year in terms of wetland extent, for instance. Soil is a nice integrator of rainfall. It shows you, the balance between evaporation and rainfall, and that's what you're seeing here. So basically, we see in the light green line 2022, which was kind of uniformly quite wet, and then we see in the dark green last year, and this is a national scale. Of course, this is not experienced anywhere. This is a national average, but it's a good representation of most of Australia saw this pattern more or less. We saw a few wet months. The first 2 months were very wet. Then, just a rapid drying and drying and drying and drying as the rain didn't fall. And then in October, November, in November particularly, the rain started picking up a bit early, a bit late in different states, but that was around about the time that that fire season that we were all fearing didn't come around. El Nino fire season, everyone was worried, and then suddenly it started raining again, thankfully. On average, soil surface protection from plants and litter improved. We get this from satellite information, and that seems to be in good shape. Vegetation condition more or less followed water availability, if you like. So in Northern Australia, which had been not been having good years for several years in a row, we saw a good increase of leaf area index, is what you're seeing there. They're basically the total area of leaves per unit area. We saw a good increase there. In parts of southern and the Carnarvon area in WA, we're seeing, as I said, maybe the first signs of drought, and in some of these parts they haven't had good rains for quite a few years as well. So a mixed picture, but you see a lot of white, and the white basically means it was pretty average across most of the country. When you look at growth conditions, and that's basically how much carbon the vegetation can suck out of the atmosphere, it was actually a very good year, and that's partly to do with the good rains now also in Northern Australia, which are keeping total numbers down a bit, but also good growing conditions during those winter months in Southern Australia, where there was enough moisture for the vegetation to grow, but it was also sunny and relatively warm, and that combined for generally good growing conditions. Fire activity on the whole was close to average, despite an early start of the fire season. Now, whenever we look at the total area burned or the total carbon emissions from fire and so forth, that is always dominated by Northern Australia just because of its size. So when we look at national statistics, you typically are not going to see the effect of the rest of Australia in it, and that was even to some extent true for the Black Summer fires, although it was a little bit different then depending on what metric you look at. But most of the fires outside Northern Australia, I should have said there, occurred in October in northern New South Wales and in southern Queensland, and that was looking pretty dire, but then it started raining again, as I said before. So in terms of fire activity, a fairly average year. In terms of carbon emissions from fire, quite a high number, mostly because of good growth and therefore a lot of fuel in Northern Australia. And then for biodiversity, I'm going to hand over to Taylor from Turner, and she's going to talk you through those indicators.
Thanks, Albert. Can everyone hear me at the back? Perfect. Before I jump in, I'd just like to again mention my co-author for the biodiversity chapter, Shoshana Rapley, who put together and analysed a lot of what I'll be showing you today. So in 2023, hundreds of species were assessed under the federal government's Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act, or the EPBC Act, and this was likely precipitated by the 2019-2020 bushfires. Following those assessments, a record 130 species were added to the list of threatened species, bringing the total number to 2,098, which was a 47% increase since 2000. The 130 additional species in 2023 blew the previous record way out of the park, which was 62 in 2009, which was still considerably higher than the average 29 species over the previous 22 years. Of the newly listed species, nearly half were directly impacted by the 2019-2020 bushfires, which included mostly plants, freshwater crayfish, and freshwater fish. 33 species were uplisted to a higher threat category, but no species were declared extinct. And 3 ecological communities were added to the list of EPBs, the list of threatened ecological communities, bringing the total to 106 ecological communities. At least 40 new species were discovered in 2023, most of which were invertebrates. Among the discoveries was a giant trapdoor spider from central Queensland. Euoplis dignitas, which is likely to be listed as endangered due to land clearing in its Brigalow Belt habitat. Citizen science data helped describe 2 new species of frogs, the Otway smooth frog and the western laughing tree frog. The Victorian grassland earless dragon was rediscovered after 50 years, and it was uplisted to being critically endangered. The primary threat to this species is Melbourne's urban development in the also critically endangered Victorian volcanic grasslands. The 2023 report on Australia's environment again drew on the amazing long-term monitoring data of the Threatened Species Index, or TSX for short. Before I jump into the results of the latest TSX results, I just want to mention that you can access our trend visualizer tool via the URL or link on the screen there. You can filter for all of the trends I'll be mentioning today, plus many more. You can view some of our diagnostic plots that outline the spatial, taxonomic, and temporal gaps in the data. And you can, most importantly, download the de-identified aggregated data, aggregated time series data for each trend that you produce. Before I jump into the numbers, I want to point out that the trends I'll be presenting are for EPBC listed threatened species only. So if you're familiar with the Threatened Species Index, we also produce trends, including near threatened species, which produce results that are a bit different. So today, just EPBC listed threatened species. So the 2023 index, which reported on trends up to 2020, revealed that the abundance of our threatened species continues to decline. Among bird species included in the TSX, abundance in 2020 was 55% lower on average than the year 2000, which corresponds to an annual rate of decline of 2.8% since the turn of the century. And looking at trends for different bird groups, the latest TSX data revealed that declines for terrestrial species were the most severe, with a 62% decline since 2000, followed by migratory shorebirds with a 47% decline and marine birds with a 24% decline since the year 2000. So the most significant declines across bird species included in the TSX were in South Australia and Queensland, with the declines for other states and territories ranging from about 13% to 59%, which were less severe, but definitely still concerning. As you can see on the bottom right trend there, the trend for Northern Territory showed a decline of 13%, but with considerable uncertainty in the trend. So we see bits that are going up and bits that are going down, and that uncertainty is driven strongly by data for migratory shorebirds in the Northern Territory. Looking at the results of the index for our other groups, for mammals, the index showed a decline in abundance of 46% since 2000, and for plants, it was a 71% decline since 2000. In some good news, the index revealed that the abundance of our threatened mammal populations are actually stabilizing and have been stabilizing in recent years, which is driven strongly by the stabilization of many small mammal populations, so those that are less than 50 grams in weight, as well as the recovery of some large mammal species, which are those weighing more than 5 kilos, which were a lot of our marine mammals. There's also some good news for plants. Data for plants revealed that species protection and management can be effective at reversing or stabilizing the decline of our threatened species. We saw that the abundance of threatened plants at actively managed sites remained stable at 45% below 2000 values, whereas those without protection declined by 73% on average since 2000. A new section that we've added to the report this year is on threatening processes. The greatest threat to Australia's biodiversity continued to be invasive species, habitat destruction, and climate change. Climate change was the major driving of new listings threatening 87% of newly listed and uplisted species in 2023. As we know, climate change is putting pressure on biodiversity with hotter and drier conditions, increased extreme weather events, and changed fire frequencies. And for the remaining 13% of newly listed and uplisted species in 2023, extinction risk factors included cane toad poisoning, habitat loss due to clearing and mining, and myrtle rust, and water extraction. So to give you a little summary of the report and what Albert and I have presented, 2023 was a year of opposites in Australia's environment, swinging from wet to dry and wet again. Environmental conditions were overall less than 2022, but well above the 2000 to 2022 average. Climate change, habitat destruction, invasive species, and the resulting biodiversity loss remain our greatest challenges. And we encourage you to visit our website to access the report, www.ausenv.turn.org.au, where you can explore the data from the report and download your regional scorecards. And I will hand back over to Beryl to close us out. Thank you.
Okay, we are going to take this outside, but before we do, I'd like you all to join me in thanking the authors, Albert van Dijk, Taylor Laurie, and Shoshana Rafferty, for their... So there are some light refreshments, and I'd love to have the opportunity to meet some of you and chat to you and get your ideas about your wish lists and so on. So let's go outside.